Hello and welcome back to our Day Tech shows. My name is Greg Stafford and I host these videos so that we can progressively work our way through the ancient biblical texts as well as other related histories. And we are currently in the book of Genesis, working our way through the accounts involving Noah and the flood. We just recently introduced the account where Noah was born to Lamech, Lamech being the son of Methuselah, and Methuselah being the son of Enoch. Now, we're going to go from that account right into the Genesis 6 introduction of the time before the flood, which leads up to the events that describe Noah, his family, the gathering of all of the animals, and then, of course, the destruction of the earth. And then the resettling of humans and animals and the time shortly after those events take place. So I'm going to do these day texts all the way through those events according to the text that I've translated, and we should be able to come up with a good understanding of the history of Genesis as it relates to Noah and the events before and shortly after the flood. So let's go ahead and take a look. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. I'll go ahead and read the Hebrew translation, followed by the Greek. And then we'll take a look at a note that I wrote about verse 4. And then we'll discuss several other aspects of our day text, including the identity of the sons of God in verse 2. All right, Genesis 6:1, Hebrew translation. Then it came to be the time when mankind, or Adamkind, shot up in number on the surface of the ground, and daughters were born to them. Verse 1, Greek translation, it came to be the time when men started to become numerous upon the earth, and daughters were born to them. Verse 2, Hebrew translation, but the sons of God, or divine beings, possibly descendants of the gods, we'll talk more about it in a moment. The sons of God were noticing daughters of mankind because they were pleasing or they were beneficial, possibly by their being able to reproduce. So they began taking women for themselves from all those whom they had selected. Verse 2, Greek translation. But the sons of God were noticing the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. So they took out for themselves women from among all those whom they picked out. Verse 3, Hebrew translation. Then Jehovah began to say, my spirit will not contend with mankind for long into the future, by reason of which he exists as flesh. Now his time has become 120 years. Verse 3, Greek translation. Then Lord God Jehovah said, my spirit will not likely remain in these men into the coming age, on account of their being flesh, but their days will be 120 years. So clearly there, he's referring to humans and even limiting our age to what we essentially see today, more or less, if we're fortunate. And yet the sons of God are referred to in verse 2. So we'll talk more about it in just a moment. Verse 4, Hebrew translation, the giants, we'll read the note in a moment, had come to be in the earth during the same days, and also later, because sons of God were coming to daughters of mankind, when they had borne to them the same kinds of strong men who from long ago were men of special reputation, the ones being born, these giants. Verse 4, Greek translation, now the giants were upon the earth in those days and after that time, as the sons of God were entering to be with the daughters of men, and the giants were born to them, the ones from an earlier age, the famous men. Okay, so are these giants born to sons of God who are humans who had relations with the daughters of men? Or are these giants children of actual divine beings who entered in among humans and had relations with the daughters of women? Let's take a look at a note about these giants first, and then we'll go back and talk more about the sons of God. And as you know, in my Sons of God video, I talk about a number of texts where that expression is used. And when we came to Genesis 6, I sort of just reviewed the material and moved past it because I didn't want to get caught up into a discussion of it when I felt other texts relating to the sons of God were more clear in terms of their identity. Today, though, I think we're going to make a clear identification since we're going to be considering evidence specific to this text. All right, so the note, though, on the giants, which we'll use to explain them and then set up the discussion about the ones it appears are having relations with the daughters of men and producing them. All right, note on Hebrew text 6:4. It goes with the Greek text note as well, because that note refers to this note. And so let's read it together. The Hebrew word Nephilim means here giants, like it does also in Numbers 13:33. The teaching of Genesis 6 concerning these particular giants is during the days described in Genesis 6:1-3, and also later, the sons of God, divine spirit beings, who are able to take on human form and human functions. You can see, for example, Genesis 19:1-3, came to the daughters of mankind and had children with them. The children of these human form spirits and daughters of men whom they took for themselves were giants. Giants who appear to have been on the earth for approximately 100 years. This is my calculation. This time frame is based in part on the age of Noah, mentioned in Genesis 5:32, part of our last day text, which is 500 years, after which Noah had 3 sons. It's also based on Genesis 6:1, which mentions the population of the earth began to rapidly spread, followed by a period of great violence among mankind, after which Genesis 7:6 says the great flood occurred. That is 100 years after Genesis 5:32, or when Noah was 600 years. So because we know the age of Noah at the time of the flood, and we know the age of Noah according to Genesis 5:32, we can determine essentially, how long these giants were on earth, more or less, at least this amount of time, at least about 100 years. Now, it's also possible the sons of God were coming to and taking the daughters of mankind earlier than Noah's 500th year, decades or even centuries earlier, during the ages of those listed from Genesis 4:18 to Genesis 5:31. Today, there are many structures known as dolmen, often referred to as giants' graves, all of which date back to the early Neolithic period of 4000 to 3000 BCE, the exact time frame that we believe is likely the period before the flood occurred, after which we have civilizations begin again, like in Sumer, and even in South America, according to the Mayan calendar, and in India when they reported the leaving of certain deities like Lord Krishna from the earth in the 3rd millennium BCE. So these dolmen also are dated to that exact time. So I've talked a little bit about dolmen before. Let me show you. These are dolmen. Okay, these are giant structures, all dated to the 3rd, 4th millennium BCE. And they're known as giants' graves. I mean, look at these things. They're massive. And you know what's interesting about these dolmen? How would you, let's say there's something buried underneath, right? It appears to me these dolmen were built to keep something in the ground, right? Or they didn't want something being disturbed, at least not very easily. Because if you tried to move these stones, I mean, where would you start? If you tried to move the top stone, I mean, you run the risk of it collapsing on you, right? What kind of machinery or what kind of system are you going to use? And how did they even get it on top of this? I mean, we know they could move ancient stone in the ancient times, but we believe they were bigger, and the sons of God were during that time involved with humans as well as the giants, and these graves are actually giants' graves. Some of them, maybe many of them, maybe all of them. Not enough research has been done to determine for sure, but there's certainly a lot of them all over the earth, not just in one place. And again, if you try to remove the top stone, you're probably going to die with it collapsing on you. If that rock falls on any part of you, you're done, or you're crushed. Whatever it touches, you're crushed. You try to remove the base stones, the stones like holding it up. I'm not talking about any stones beneath it, right? I mean, there could be stones below the stones you see propping up the top stone. So, I mean, if there's a giant skeleton, a famous giant, like it says in the text, a men of renown, the famous ones, if these are the graves of those beings, well, it would make sense that they would go through this much trouble to protect them and to keep people from disturbing them. And again, I think that they're set up in a way to where you can't dig in and start taking out whatever's in there, because they will collapse upon you. You'll have to then at least begin to remove the collapsed dolmen stones if you survive the collapse. So these dolmen are amazing, and they're all dated to the same period of time that we've been discussing. So let's go back to the text for a moment. That takes care of the giant aspect. You can look at it more on your own in terms of the giants, but I think the text is very clear. The terms used, you have Nephilim. Some can consider that also potentially meaning fallen one. But the Greek text is very clear. The ancient legends associated with the famous ones of old, like Hercules or other beings potentially in view in the Genesis text, Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, men of special reputation, famous ones. So these would be very large beings. They're described in those ways, superhuman ways almost. And then we have, of course, these dolmen. But let's go back and talk about a couple of things here. Let me bring it up. We'll talk a little bit about these sons of God. Okay, well, let's just look at it from a textual standpoint. So, first of all, there really isn't any kind of understanding attached to this text different from angels or spirit beings until you get to about the 2nd century CE, where certain Christian writers and Jewish rabbis began to write differently about Genesis 6. And in my view, it's because, of course, in the Christian texts and people who eventually became Christians, Trinitarians like Augustine and others, I don't think they could really deal well with Genesis chapter 6 and the reference to divine beings coming to the earth, having relations with humans. They just can't, they're not comfortable with the text as it reads. And so they began questioning it. But the Septuagint text, the Codex Vaticanus, has sons of God, just like the Hebrew does. Alexandrinus reads angels of God. Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion all read sons of God. And as we're going to see in a moment, the texts in 1st Enoch and in Jubilees that speak of these same events in Genesis 6 refer to them as angels of God, even naming, in the case of 1st Enoch, many of them, including one that is named in the Jerusalem Targum of Genesis 6. Two are named. Genesis 6 and the Jerusalem Targum is translated so that it says sons of the great ones, but then it goes on to identify two that fell from heaven as Shemhazai and Azael. So, and Shemhazai is also mentioned specifically apart from the others in 1st Enoch. We're going to read that in just a moment. But not necessarily all the texts in 1st Enoch that pertain to these events, just the ones that specifically identify the sons of God as angels of God. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. So we'll read Jubilees and Enoch. Since we were reading Enoch, or referring to it just a moment ago, let's start there. Now, Enoch, as we've discussed in prior shows, specifically in our Jude day texts, since Jude refers to Enoch and the writings of Enoch, specifically 1st Enoch, which wasn't known as 1st Enoch then, but that's the reference he's making, is to 1st Enoch. So, and Jude, as we know in Jude 6, refers to the angels that left their place and were punished by Jah because they didn't pay attention to their own beginning. And so you have Jude specifically referring to angels who left their place and also referring to Enoch. And so here is what Enoch has to say in 1 Enoch chapter 6. We'll read verses 1 and 2. It came to pass when the children of men had multiplied in those days, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And then, as I mentioned, it goes on to mention Shemhazai, one of the two angels specifically named in the Jerusalem Targum translation, the Aramaic translation of Genesis 6. So now let's take a look at Jubilees. So Enoch, we have support for Enoch in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've done several videos on the text of Enoch. And of course, Jude referring to Enoch and to the angels that left their place and were punished. Now we have the book of Jubilees, which is also represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically for chapter 5 and part of verses 1 and 2, which we're going to read in 11Q Jub, J-U-B, if you want to look it up. So it says right here in the book of Jubilees, And it came to pass, when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the angels of God saw them on a certain year of this Jubilee, that they were beautiful to look upon. And they took themselves wives of all whom they chose, and they bare unto them sons, and they were giants. And lawlessness increased on the earth. And so this then goes on to further discuss parts of the account, but I want to just stay in terms of the book of Jubilees and Enoch on the point we're discussing, and that is the identity of the sons of God. And so we have Enoch, we have Jude referring to Enoch and to the angels that left their place and were punished. We have Jubilees that, like Enoch, refers specifically to or uses the same type of language that Genesis 6 does when it talks about this time before the flood and when men began to multiply. Now let's go back to the Genesis text itself. Okay, so the Hebrew text uses sons of God, which idiomatically means gods, right? That's the way that was understood. That's why the sons of God, even not only in Psalm 82 in the Council of God's texts, where God enters in among them and judges them because they're failing in their appointment as gods of the nations, just like we read about in corroborating Dead Sea Scroll texts in terms of the view of that text at that time. But we have the Hebrew text which does that. We have the Vaticanus text of the Greek text which uses sons of God, just like the Hebrew. Alexandrinus uses angels of God. Symmachus Theodotion and Aquila use sons of God. Enoch uses angels of God. Jubilees uses angels of God. So why does anyone think anything differently when it comes to the reference to the sons of God in these texts? As I mentioned, it's, in my opinion, usually because the people have a problem with the sons of God being gods and then coming down and doing the things the Bible describes. In other words, they don't really believe the text. They want to be thought of as believing what the Bible says, but then they replace it with what they want it to say or believe. And so when it comes to things like these, where the evidence is overwhelming, they'll go into things and say like, well, it says here, like I mentioned when I was reading the text, that his spirit isn't going to remain in these men. And so that's obviously referring to the men, right? So why wouldn't that be a reference to the sons of God who were just being discussed in terms of their, we'll say, obsession, or certainly noticing, and to a high degree of interest, the daughters of men? Well, let's take a closer look. Notice verse 1 again. Then it came to be the time when mankind, or Adamkind, shot up in number on the surface of the ground. Right? Same thing in the Greek. Came to be the time when men started to become numerous on the earth. Right? Okay. Look at this part. And daughters were born to them. Look at that. So, to me, that is the key. Why? Because if the men were the ones the daughters were born to, how could they be the sons of God? How could the sons of God be men when the daughters are being born to the men? It refers not only to mankind, Adamkind, and then in verse 2, the daughters of the men. Daughters of mankind. The sons of God were noticing the daughters of men. Men are sons of other men, not sons of God. Especially not at this time when that was a reference known to refer to the angels of God, according to all ancient sources and texts. But to me, right here, verse 1, the daughters are born to the men. The sons of God notice the daughters of men. So the men specifically in this context who are giving birth to these daughters are the ones with whom just spirit will not contend indefinitely. Because they're giving their daughters, or whatever's taking place, the daughters from these men are being taken by the sons of God, which then leads to the giants and then the corruptive influence and atmosphere. But so if Jehovah is no longer going to contend with humans because of the way that the earth is evolving based on these interactions and relationships, then there's no reason to see that as identifying the sons of God as the men with whom he's not going to contend for long into the future, right? Because if the sons of God are taking the daughters of men to produce these giants, what is it that they would want? They would want their children, the giants, to keep living. And that's what I believe is also going on here, that the interaction between the sons of God and the daughters of men and the long lives of the men that are giving birth to these daughters that the sons of God are choosing are also being passed on in the genetics to these giants. And Jehovah is saying, I'm not going to allow these long lives of these humans to continue on so that I have to contend with this process of them not doing what's right. I mean, we could go from Cain all the way to, I'm sure, events taking place with other humans now, to the fact that their daughters are being used by the sons of God to reproduce giants, which then go on to create these famous reputations in ways that produce glory for themselves, not Jehovah, and obviously lead to the violent environment that is described for us in subsequent texts. So let's go through this again. There's a time that comes to be when men, mankind, Adamkind, humans, man and daughters, obviously, mankind, Adamkind, shot up, and they had daughters born to them in this process. It's part of the process of humans being born. Daughters are being born. So the daughters are being born to the men. And the sons of God, not the sons of men. If it would have said the daughters were born to Adamkind and the sons of men were noticing the daughters, well, then it'd be obvious. That's not what it says. And that's not what other ancient texts say. When they don't say sons of God, it's always angels, Enoch, Jubilees, the Septuagint text of Alexandrinus. So there's really no dispute textually in terms of who we're discussing here until you get into the 2nd, 3rd, and later centuries. And in terms of the actual texts themselves, the context, it says very clearly that the Adamkind that was shooting up in number had daughters born to them. And then the sons of God noticed the daughters that were born to men, daughters of mankind. Sons of God, daughters of mankind. The daughters are born to the mankind, and the sons of God notice them. So we know the sons of God cannot be the mankind who are giving birth to their own daughters. It's possible they would be the sons being born through that same process, but it would then have to say the sons born to them, the mankind, or sons of mankind, sons of the men. It does not say that, okay? So textually and contextually, textually in terms of the various readings of Genesis from ancient texts, all the way through to the 2nd century, or up until, of course, the Septuagint text manuscripts dates, and even the readings in the text, like in the Ethiopic version of Enoch and Jubilees. We have Dead Sea Scroll text for those, but primarily they're in other language versions. Nonetheless, when it comes to these texts in Genesis, it states very clearly that mankind were shooting up in number. So we know sons were being born in order for them to shoot up in number, and they were having daughters born to them. The daughters born to the men were noticed by the sons of God, not the sons of mankind. There's no way you can read the text and come up with a different conclusion. You can believe something different, right? You can believe something different if you want, but that's not what the text says. That's not what any ancient version of the text says. And that's not what Jude appears to believe based on the events described in terms of what took place before the flood. But I think the terms I've highlighted and read here are critical. Along with, by comparison, we could say the sons of God, because I'll just make a little color difference here. Because if they were referring to men, right here and here, it would have said sons of men. Just like it does with the daughters that were born to them. There'd be no reason to differentiate between the two, especially given the Hebrew idiom and understanding of sons of, as I explained in my Sons of God video, which you can take a look in the description below. So I think it's pretty conclusive, both textually and contextually, that the sons of God in Genesis 6:2 are the angels of God, several of which are specifically named in texts like Enoch and in the Jerusalem Targum as having descended from heaven and interacted with human daughters and giving birth to these giants who became these famous ones, giants who are associated with these massive structures known as dolmen that are all over the earth and that are dated to the same time when the events described in Genesis 6 are said to have occurred. So, again, we have corroborating evidence for what Genesis describes when it comes to this time before the flood and the interaction of sons of God, divine beings, and humans, specifically the daughters of humans, because they were either beneficial in terms of their reproductive power or beautiful or both. And through this involvement, this interaction between the sons of God and the daughters of mankind, giants were born. Giants who became famous ones. Probably many of those whom we hear about in the ancient records of old. And so I wanted to share this information specifically so we had a good understanding when it comes to getting going with the account involving the flood, what the account says as far as the beings who were involved during this time with humans. So we had Satan, of course, getting involved with Adam and Eve, then their banishment from the garden. Then we had all the different things that occurred relative to Cain, Abel, the children of Adam and Eve, of Cain, and those he took as his wife, and the others mentioned from the time forward. and those whom they took as their wives, all the way to Enoch himself, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. And here we are now with the humans having multiplied in number on the earth, beautiful, beneficial daughters being born to them that even the divine sons of God have noticed. And they're starting to take them for themselves. And as a result, Jehovah limits the lifespan of humans who were existing at that time as part of this pre-flood world and who were giving birth to these daughters that were being taken as reproductive instruments, at least, or in part, so that their offspring, these giants, wouldn't continue to increase and live these hundreds of years that humans up until that time had been blessed with, in spite of their not doing everything right. But as we're going to see, there is one who finds favor with Jehovah, and he chooses him for a very special, famous mission that's described in great detail and also has a wealth of corroborating evidence, both from the things that he's told to do, the structure he's told to build, the animals he's told to collect, but also the things that take place after he does what Jehovah says. And we're going to talk all about it. So I hope you'll join me for our next Day Text show, where we'll consider more of the Genesis 6 account and work our way through to the great flood of Noah.